Okay, to begin today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the vocabulary for Lesson 4. As you know, the vocabulary is under this icon over here on the left, and the vocabulary list for Lesson 4 is right here. Now, you might want to notice that the homework for the next class will be to complete the open book quiz 2, which is in the back of your book, along with the other all 5 quizzes. And it'll be on lessons 3 and 4. Okay, so we'll start with the words over here. And the first word is abstract art, and you can follow along by looking in the back of your book on the glossary if you'd want to. Abstract art is really any kind of object that is derived from something in the real world but is not realistic. If you look over here, we have 2 student drawings. This drawing here is actually a group of rectangular objects or rectilinear solids that are arranged in what's called a still life. So this was derived from a real situation, and you'll notice that it does look very abstract because there's no lines in here, and so it isn't really a realistic depiction. It looks like an interesting design of some sort. It's really just an odd-looking shape. This is a sort of a spool object here. And again, it's just the outlines of it, so it's really more of an abstract or abstraction of something real. What you have here is also an abstract drawing of a stool. Now, you notice here, if you look right here on these edges, where you see, well, if this was a real stool, you might see a line here. You know, where the leg goes under the seat, you might see some overlapping things here where this support bar might be running around the outside of the leg and overlapping the leg. Well, none of those things are present. So the artist actually abstracted a real object. So that's called abstract art. Okay, now we have a couple terms over here. We're going to talk about closure, continuous line drawing, contour drawing, freehand drawing, landscape format, portrait, and viewfinder. So I'm going to be talking about this diagram here, but I'm going to redraw the diagram. Instead of using a group of these rectilinear solids like you see here, that's really a description of what's here. I'm going to draw a stool, which is basically this type of arrangement here that you'll be doing in one of your exercises. So I'm going to move this out of the way. Now, I'm going to use this piece of paper. This is a small sketch pad paper. This is about 8 by 10. But you can imagine that this would be the same proportion as your 18 by 24 large drawing pad. So I'm going to review a couple terms first of all, because in order to talk about the terms in the vocabulary like closure and everything, we need to have, the first thing is a border. So I'm going to use what's called a freehand drawing or freehand line. Now, we talked about how to make a straight line in Lesson 1. A freehand line, you would just draw it without the use of any mechanical aids. So you see how I'm just drawing. Now, you notice how I laid my hand down on the board when I did that, instead of holding my hand up here, because that's a lot more difficult to do, to get it straight. Now, a freehand just simply means you aren't using a ruler or any other mechanical device. So I'm drawing a border on my paper that the relationship of this is approximately the same as if you were drawing on a large piece of paper and doing this. But we're just illustrating these vocabulary terms right now. Okay, so there's a complete border on the paper. Now, this border now has a picture plane, which is this in here, and we talked about that last time. Okay, now what we need in a picture plane next is what we talked about last time, is a shape. So I'm going to draw, as I said, and I'm just going to set this over here. I'm going to draw this, just from memory. Okay, so. And you can follow along. Now, if I just draw, I'm just going to draw it anywhere, or as you might say, if you're looking at that page right now, it's not touching the border. and it probably looks something like this. Now, I did a couple things here. This might be a stool, but it's even more abstract than this one, because it is a stool derived from something in real life, okay? But it's not complete. But another thing about this is I just did a continuous line drawing. Now, continuous line drawing, which is also a freehand drawing, is where I used the pencil, I touched the paper, I kept going, I did not pick the pencil up. And so that's called a continuous line drawing, because it's continuous. It's not like here, here, and here, and just stopping and going. Okay. Now, this is also called a contour drawing, but we will get into the word contour in the next lecture for this lesson when I talk about doing the exercise. You actually have two of them. We're going to do one in class and then the other one for homework. Now, the other thing about this what we talked about was closure. And closure, first of all, to understand closure, you have two things here. This is a shape right here. This is a shape. Yes, it looks like a chair or a stool, sort of. But whenever you take an outline, right, and you close something in, it's now a shape. And I'm just shading it really quickly just to illustrate, to separate that from the background, because now you have a shape, but this is also called a figure, if you remember from last time, right? It's also called positive space. The background is ground. It's also negative space. Now, closure is a term that's used to break up the ground or background, if you want to call it that, or negative space. In this case, there is no breakup. In other words, since the shape does not touch the border, you have one continuous background. So what is preferred here is that, and what you're going to be learning to do now is to always form closure by touching two opposite borders, which is here. You have a border which goes all the way around. Opposite borders means touching the top and the bottom in this case, or you could touch the sides. That's going to depend on the shape of your object. In other words, if it was this way, they wouldn't be touching top and bottom. They'd have to touch this way. To get them to touch top and bottom, it's impossible because the shape's not wide enough. It's going to get too big before it will touch the top and bottom, you see. So usually you can only do that in one proportion or one direction. And so you have two other terms here. One's called landscape format and portrait format. Whenever you're drawing something that is taller than it is wide, you should always have your paper vertical. Vertical is called the portrait format. And whenever the object obviously is wider, if I'm going to bring this back in and look at this, when the group of objects is wider than it is tall, then that is called landscape format. So what you have right here is portrait format here and landscape format right here. And these are both abstract drawings of real objects. Okay, I'm going to do one more thing here with the vocabulary. I'm going to switch paper here. And I want to talk about closure now. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to do another freehand drawing, another freehand drawing of a border, because I'm not using a ruler. And you don't have to use a ruler. It's actually better if you don't use a ruler. You get better at it. You get better at drawing straight lines if you don't use a ruler all the time. Okay, now I'm going to take this one, and what I'm going to do is form closure by doing a continuous line drawing on here and touching two opposite border edges. Since this is a portrait format and this object is taller than it is wide, I'm gonna touch this border and this border. Now we'll talk more about how to approach something like this in a continuous line drawing, but in this case what I'm going to do is first I'm looking for the lowest part of this shape. The lowest part of this shape in the picture plane is here. The highest part of this shape in the picture plane is the middle of this curve. That's a pretty, my curve's a little crooked, but that's where it is. So I want this to touch here, and I want this to touch here. Now, when you look at what's going to happen on your exercise in the next lecture, you'll say, well, they don't touch here. Yes, that's okay right now. We're just describing the word closure right now. And then when you do in-class exercises, you will want to form closure when drawing an object similar to this. And this is the way you will do that. You'll practice with these in the book and then do some in class. Okay, so if I was to start that, I'm going to start at the top where I know it's touching the border. And I can go left or right, it doesn't really matter. Now there's a lot of other things to consider when doing this. And obviously, I'm doing this, I've done this a couple times in order to speed up this presentation. But there's a lot of different ways to measure these things to make sure that you get them accurate. But the first thing you want to learn to do is just to do a continuous line drawing of something and see if you can get it to look fairly like the original. That's really the idea. And you'll do a few of these, and you're just starting to learn how to do this, so it's not really, you'll get it. It just takes a little practice. Now you look at the difference here, and what happened was I formed closure. By now I have this positive shape, and I have a negative shape here and a negative shape here, but the shapes end right here. So these are two different shapes. They end here. So I have formed what's called closure by closing up this background. Now that produces a stronger looking relationship of the figure to ground when it's not what they call floating in the middle of the picture plane with a lot of space around it. Now you might say, well, there's times when, how can you always do that? Then the objects are always too big. Well, if you're doing other objects in the picture plane, sometimes they can form closure too and help a main object. And you'll learn that later on, because there's a lot of different complicated ways to do that. Right now, you're just simply learning the simple vocabulary and learning how to do continuous line, freehand drawing, and do contours. Okay, the last thing on there is the viewfinder, and I'm going to get this other thing over here. This is let me just turn the page here real quick. Lesson 9. There is a viewfinder area in Lesson 9. It may look like this, and sometimes your book may be look similar to this one, or there might be one that's a little more shifted over. You can cut this out and take this out of the page, or you can make one that looks like this. Now, what this dark rectangle is for is it is of the right proportion. You will learn about proportion later. But in any event, see, you'll notice that this hole is just the exact same size. So this is just used as something for you to scale this to. So you make it, everyone makes one that's similar, because you will use this later in this lesson here, which is lesson 9, when working with this still life. Okay, so right now we're just going to be using this in our in-class exercises because we need to approximate, and I'm going to move this out of the way for a minute, a rectangle that's similar to this so that you can judge your spacing. And I'll talk about that when I draw this in the next lecture. This particular one here, if you follow this rectangle right here and put about a 2-inch border on your paper, it'll look something like this. And this is a fairly good size of a viewfinder for you to use. Now you notice how this paper is somewhat flimsy, so your instructor may give you a heavier piece of cardstock. Also, you can use a piece of cardboard, although that's a little more challenging to cut out, or mat board, but you could also do that. But what this does is it isolates the view, and a viewfinder basically is similar to a camera lens or limiting the view of what you're looking at. Now, when using something like this, though, it depends on how close or how far away it is from your face as to what you're going to see. In other words, if I was to put this here, and I don't know how this is going to work on this camera here, but you see this is all you can see. But if I was to bring it up closer to the camera, you probably can see more through there. And that works the same way with your eye. And you notice this is a landscape format. So if I was drawing something with a portrait format, I would want to use this way. Okay? One other thing you can do with a viewfinder like this is you can divide it off to help you divide off larger pieces of paper. In other words, this is in about the same proportion as your sketch pad, which is 18 by 24. In proportion, which means that the width and the height are proportional even though it's smaller. You'll learn more about that in the upcoming next 2 lessons. But what you could do here, just to help you out for now, and I'll talk about it a little bit in the next lecture, is put a little marks on here halfway, and I mean halfway. And if you want to be more accurate than me, you probably want to use a ruler for that, because you are measuring. Because you can see right here, this one's not in the middle.